reality, my diamonds that cold. Versace trunks, I hit my backstroke. Knock on the door, she at the back row.
Welcome back to Houdini Is Hip. In this part, we're looking at rendering. In the previous part, we went ahead and we made a donut. And if you want that donut, you can go ahead and download it in the link below. It'll be pinned as a comment. In this part, we're going to be looking at how to make that donut look good. How we're going to turn it into an actual image. Now, before we even go into that, let's just get an understanding of what rendering is and why we do it. So at the moment, we have this donut in this 3D scene, right? And we can move about and we can look at it at different angles. But as you may have noticed, in our viewport, it doesn't really look like anything. It doesn't look like a real donut. It doesn't have any sort of material. It's not really lit in any particular way. There's no fancy lighting. It doesn't look realistic in the slightest. And that's because it's currently just a preview. What we need to do is we need to take that and we need to render it. So we need to create a virtual camera. We need to set up some lights and we need to give our donut a material. Sure, it has a color, but it doesn't have an actual material or anything defining the way that it interacts with light. So technically this donut could be glass, right? It could be glass, it could be made of water, it could be anything really. We haven't actually defined that. That's what a material does. The first thing we're gonna have to do is set up a camera, and a camera is gonna define a couple of things. It's gonna define what's in our frame, so what's going to be rendered out. It's also going to define things like focal length and depth of field, motion blur. All of those things are going to be derived from the camera's settings. And that camera mimics real life cameras. So we're actually technically creating a virtual camera in our 3D scene. Then we can add things like lights so that this donut receives light rays. And then what we can do is add materials. So we can add things that actually define how our donut is going to interact with its environment. Once we have that, we use a render engine. Now the render engine is the part of the software that actually figures out how to render things. So it figures out how to deal with light bounces, how to deal with materials, and all of those things. And different render engines have different looks. Inside of Houdini, there's actually two render engines. There's Mantra and there's Karma. Now Karma is the newer renderer. For a long time, Mantra was used in mostly films, really. It was a bit slow to be used just by hobbyists, but Karma is the improved version. So Karma is a new renderer, and it's got a whole new set of functionality. We're going to be using Karma, and not really looking at Mantra. So, okay, let's go straight into our scene with our donut, and let's continue from where we left off last. We're just going to be doing a bit of a revision run as well, so let's go ahead. Currently, we have this donut. So firstly, let's actually set it up for a render. Like this, it's not going to look great, so maybe we want it turned on its side, right? Lying down on maybe a tabletop or something like that. So we can try that. And you may be tempted to just rotate it from here, right? You may want to just rotate it 90 degrees and our coconut gets left behind. And the reason for that is that this is the container. We discussed this a couple of times, and what we're doing is we're moving the container, not the actual geometry. So what's happening is our coconut generator is picking up the position of the geometry and not the geometry relative to the container, if that makes sense. And so there's a couple of ways to work around that. Either we can tell our coconut, hey, by the way, maybe take into consideration the fact that this is moving around inside of our container, or we can just transform it inside of the actual donut. So we don't do a translation on the actual object, we do a translation inside here, maybe with this transform node. So we can switch on our transform handles and just make this donut lie down. And we can also move it up a little so that it's above the ground plane. Just like that. And if we go up a level now you'll see that the coconut sits on it, right? Because we affected the actual geometry and not just the container. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a grid. This grid is just going to act as a ground plane. It's not really going to do anything. We can just call it floor. And that's that, right? We have this donut sitting on the floor. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and drop a camera now. And so you can find a good angle for this, maybe something like that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go up to the top right, and under lights and cameras, you should see camera. If we control click on the camera, it will create a camera at our current view. So control click on the camera, and what you'll notice is a couple of things. Firstly, we now have a camera in our object network, right? That's a different type of node. So you haven't seen this one before. These are all object nodes. This one is a camera node. This one has different settings, right? And you can see it's called Cam1. Now, over here in our viewport, you might notice that we have this red at the top and bottom. That means we're looking through our camera, and if we move around, so if we go to our view mode and we move around, the position of this camera is changing, right? So we're actually defining the position of this camera. And if you want to move around your viewports without actually affecting your camera, you're going to need to untoggle this lock. And in the top right over here, you can see that cam 1 is currently locked to our view. So as we move our view, cam 1 moves. We can unlock it. So we just click on this lock over here, that red disappears, and now we're just viewing it through the perspective of camera 1. But if we move away, we're no longer affecting camera 1. You can see it's actually just sitting over there, right? And so we can go back to the top right, and we can look through camera 1, just like that. So we're back to viewing through the camera. Okay, so we have a camera sitting in our scene, and we can view our donut through our camera's perspective. But we still don't have any lights in our scene. To add lights, we can do it the same way that we added a camera. We can look through a certain perspective, and we can place a light, or we can just place a light in the scene and move it about to wherever we want. So I'm going to do the way where we place it through our perspective first. I'm just going to move to wherever I want this light. I'm going to hold from this position, Control, and then click on an area light. So over here, I have an area light. Again, you'll see that it's red. That means that if we move around in this view, the actual position of the light will change. And over here, I'm going to switch from headlight only to normal lighting. What this means is that we're now actually viewing how the light affects our scene. So you'll notice that as I'm moving in this perspective, the light is actually adjusting. And if I switch off the lock, so once again, once you switch off that lock, you're no longer locking the position of the light to your view. So if we do that, we can then move around freely and our light just sits nicely in place. And you can see that it's casting some light over there. All right, we got a light and we've got a camera. So what do we do now? We have a couple of options. We could take a look at how this looks rendered. And so to do that, we have to go to another context. Currently, we've only been working at the object level. The object level, as we've said before, is where we place all of our objects, we place our lights, we place our cameras, right? All of the things that we want to place goes in our object level. But if we want to render, we're going to have to go to another context. So we're going to go to the out context. So if we go to our object network over here, there's a drop down and we can go to the out network. If we click on that, it's empty, right? There's nothing going on here. And don't worry, your nodes aren't gone. We're just in a different network. The out network is here. The object network is here, right? Two different networks. So we're going to go to the out network. The out network is for outputting. So if we want to output an image or render, then we would do it from here. So at our out network, if we press tab, we have access to a bunch of different nodes. What we're looking for is the Karma node. Now, remember, I said that we have Mantra and we have Karma. Now, Karma is the new renderer, and Karma has some extra functionality, and it's a much faster renderer than Mantra was. And to use Karma, we can just drop a Karma node. So right over there, you just type Karma, and we have a Karma node. Okay, so I'm going to go through the settings on this Karma node before we actually do anything with it. So as you'll see at the top over here, we have Karma Viewport, render to disk, render to mplay, render to disk in background. Don't worry about that for now. That's basically just telling it, okay, we want to start seeing some outputs, start working. So that's when you actually have all of your settings in place. You go ahead and you click on one of those and you'll generate an output. However, before we get there, we need to look at some of these other settings. So firstly, what are we rendering? Well, we're rendering the current frame. If you want to render out a sequence or an animation, then you change that and you say render frame range. So maybe we have 100 frames that we want to render out. Then we say render frame range and we set it from 1 to 100. But we just want this single frame for now. Over here, this is the output picture. What it'll do is it'll save your image to this location. Don't worry about that for now, we'll get back to that later. Over here, we have our camera, right? We're saying, okay, object camera 1. So the object network, the camera called camera 1 is the one that we want this render node to render out. So what it'll do is when we render an image, it'll find camera 1 in our object network, and it'll use that camera. Okay, so if we have other cameras, we can very easily find them. And you can go over here, and you'll see that we just have the one camera. So that's fine. Over here, we have a resolution. As you may expect, you can increase or decrease the resolution. It'll change the framing of the camera. We also have the render engine, CPU engine, or XPU. XPU is still in beta at the time of recording. It might be out of beta by the time the next version of Houdini is released, but for now it's still in beta. So XPU uses both your GPU or your graphics card and your CPU. CPU just uses CPU. So CPU is slightly slower than XPU, but XPU is currently still in beta. So there's some things that don't quite work perfectly just yet. So we're just going to be using CPU for now. And eventually when XPU goes gold, we'll look at that in more detail. All of these other settings, we're not going to worry about right now, right? Most of these things you won't need to touch right now. They're all kind of efficiency things and increasing the quality of your renders and things like that. But for the most part, you just need to know these few things up here. The last thing that's important is the primary samples. So the higher you push this up, the higher the quality of your render, but also the slower your render becomes. So at 9, the default should be okay. So we're not going to change anything for now. All we're going to do is go to the Karma Viewport. Over there in the top left, if we click Karma Viewport, what we'll see is a pop-up over here. And over here we have this Karma perspective showing through camera 1. And we're looking at our donut, right? Our donut is sitting in our scene over here. And now it's being rendered. This is actually a render. You can see that it says rendering and it gives you a percentage. We can switch back to that other view. So if we go to the Houdini GL view, that's just your scene, right? This is just how it looks. This over here is the same as how your viewport looks, right? So this is a separate viewport. This is the Karma viewport. From here, you can just adjust your render settings and things. So once your scene is looking good, you can come to your Karma viewport and you can mess around with your render settings and things. So again, we can switch this from this Houdini GL to Karma. So we're going to switch it back to Karma and it starts rendering, right? And we can still navigate this viewport, but now we're rendering and you'll see that it's noisier and it's not as crisp and it takes some time to clean up. That's simply because we're rendering. It has to do all of these calculations now because we actually have a light source and materials and all sorts of other things to take into account. Okay, so I'm just going to close this. We now know that this Karma viewport exists. So we're going to go ahead and keep adding materials and things, and then we can go back to our Karma viewport and look at our render a second time. So I'm going to add another light just because our scene was quite dark. I'm going to go ahead and add an area light, and over here we can lock it and then move about. So locking it to our view, moving it about until we're happy with where it is. Now on the area light, we have some settings, right? So if we go to the area light, under the parameters, we have some settings. So exposure is how bright this is, right? So we can increase the brightness of our light, but we can also change its color. So if we want to make it a slightly yellow or warm light, let's do a slightly orange light, something like that. You can see that it's now casting an orange light from that side and just this pure white light from the left side. Okay, so we have a camera and we have two lights. However, we still haven't addressed materials or shaders. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, when we add materials, we can obviously go to the material network, right? If we go over here, we can build a bunch of materials in here and then assign them to our donut. However, I'm going to go back to the object level and I'm going to show you something else. So instead of going to the material network this time, we're actually going to create a material network ourselves. So what we can do is we can go ahead and type matnet or material network. And over here, we can create this little matnet. So what this does is it actually creates a material network for us that's easier to access. So we don't have to go over here and then go to the material network and then jump back and forth. We just have it over here and we can see it where everything else is, right? So over there we have our camera and our lights. Over there are all of our objects, and over here is our material network, and we can just call it materials. And then we can dive inside. So double click on it, dive inside. Now, when we're rendering, different render engines use different shaders. Now, shaders are the blocks of code that are used to generate materials, right? So different render engines obviously have different code, so they need different shaders. And so in our case, we're going to be using the principled shader. That's the one that Houdini recognizes for Karma and Mantra. You can also use Material X, which is something that's pretty cool. Material X can be used in many different render engines, and so you can create a material in one software with one render engine, and technically your render should look very similar in every other render engine. So we'll look at Material X at a later point, but we're just going to be using a principled shader for now. So we're going to drop down a principled shader. Right over here, we're going to call it Donut. And currently it doesn't do anything. If we look at the settings over here, you'll see that it has just a couple of things over here. We have basic, which is for base color and things like that. We have specular, reflection, transparency, subsurface scattering, sheen, emission. By adjusting all of these settings, you get different types of materials. For example, glass isn't very rough, so you would drop the specular roughness very low, and you can also see through glass, right? So you would go ahead and increase its transparency. If you're looking at something like skin, right? Skin is slightly reflective, so you'll have a little bit of reflectivity. And it also has subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering is that kind of thing where you hold a torch up to your hand and you can kind of see the red through your skin, or if you're outdoors in the light and you can see the sun shining through your ear, that's all subsurface scattering, right? So by adjusting all of these settings, you end up with pretty much every material you can possibly imagine. You can add metallics, whatever you want, right? So our donut, we're going to try to mimic an actual donut. So we're going to have to look at how to make this look like dough. So I'm going to go up a level, and on my spiral donut object, I'm going to go over to the render tab in its settings. Over here, you'll see that it has an option for materials. Now this material over here, you can go ahead and expand your materials and select donut. If you accept it, you'll see that it now has this over here. Can be found inside of object, materials, and the one we're looking for is donut. And if we go to that path, it's simply this over here. Object level, materials, donut. So we have now assigned this material to our donut. So if we go to the out level and we go to the Karma Viewport and we look at our render, you'll notice that our donut looks a little bit different. It doesn't look great, but it does look different, right? There's something different about it. And that's because it now has a material attached to it, right? And if we go into this material network, and again, you can minimize this Karma Viewport, you can shrink it down and just have it over here, open on the side. You can go ahead into your material network and make changes. So you can actually view your changes live. So we can go ahead and adjust some settings. Firstly, this base color over here. As you may remember, we have a color on our donut. Now, that color is saved as an attribute called CD, and our render engines actually recognize that. That's why our donut is still brown, but it actually tints it with the base color. We can tell it to not use that brown color at all. If we switch off use point color, then it only uses the base color. Or, if we want to just use our point color, we set this to white so that it doesn't tint it at all, and that's the color that we end up with. But I'm going to say don't use point color, right? So don't use my CD attribute, simply use what I'm giving you here. So the base color, I can find whatever color I want now, right? And I can adjust how it looks. So I'm going to try and make it look a bit more like a donut, something like that maybe. Now, if we want this to actually look like a donut, we're going to have to make more changes to this. So I'm going to push the roughness pretty high so that it's like a piece of dough. Right? As you can see, when we increase this, it gets less reflective. Over here, it's a super glossy donut. All the way over on the side, it's a very rough donut. I'm going to go ahead and add some subsurface scattering, because if you look at a piece of dough and you hold it up to some light kind of leaks through it, right? So we're going to add some subsurface over here. And what you'll notice is that it starts to look kind of squishy, right? It looks a little bit doughy or a bit like a gel. And that's exactly what we want, actually. We're going to decrease the subsurface distance over here so that the light doesn't go too deep into the object or right through it, right? It just gives it a kind of softness to its surface. So as you decrease that, you end up with that. And you can change the subsurf color as well. So if we do something like that, then that's actually very similar to what I was talking about earlier when light shines through your ear. That red color defines what color is shining through. So if we change this to like a blue, you'll get this weird looking effect. But that's because the light that's shining through it is picking up as blue. So you can imagine that as maybe there's like something blue inside of the donut, right? Like how we have red blood inside of us, so the light shines through and appears as red, something blue inside the donut. But we can just change that to a color that actually works for this, something like that. And that's actually starting to look pretty good. So I'm going to go up a level at our object level over here and just hide our coconut for a bit, right? I just want to look at what we have with our donut. And as you can see, it's kind of interesting. We have this strange looking donut. It's a bit squishy and soft looking, but it's actually not bad. Okay, so let's add a bit of a bumpiness to this, right? It's very smooth. It looks disturbingly like a baby at the moment. So let's go ahead and add a bit of displacement. Now we can go over here to the displacement tab, and displacement is something that's added to a surface after you've already created it. So in the case of our donut, we want little pores and little bumps and things, little holes, things like that. And so we can actually add displacement that affects the surface that we don't have to actually model into the donut, right? We can have it as something that we add afterwards. And so to do that, we're going to go over to displacement and enable noise displacement. What this will do is it'll just displace our donut based on a noise pattern. By default, it's going to result in something pretty crazy looking. I mean, that is kind of cool, actually, but not exactly what we want. So we want to drop that quite a bit. So amplitude, remember, we mentioned that amplitude is the amount, right? Amplitude is just how much of something you want. We want very little, actually, so we can just do 0.1. And you'll notice that it's a little bit bumpy. It's still not right, but it's got some bump to it. Frequency is how often something's occurring, right? We also went over this a little while ago, but if you increase the frequency, you have a noise pattern that repeats more. So it becomes technically smaller. So by increasing the frequency, you'll end up with bumps that are finer, right? The spacing between them is finer, things like that. So we can keep increasing that frequency to something like 50 or close to 50. And as you can see, that's actually kind of nice. All we have to do is drop this amplitude now to something like 0.01, and that looks pretty good. Okay, so we've got a donut. A little bit of light gets through thanks to subsurf. It's got its color, and it's got a little bit of a bumpiness based on our displacement. The last thing that we would want is that layer of syrup. So the layer of syrup that goes over the donut makes it kind of shiny. So we can actually go back over to the surface over here, and over here, under reflection, we have this option for coat. I'm going to give it a coat. What that does is it adds a coat, and that looks kind of gross right now, but we can increase the roughness on it a little bit until we're happy with how it looks. Something like that, and I'm just going to change the color of this donut. Okay, so let's look at it through our camera view, and it's not looking too bad. It does look kind of squishy and weird, but I will admit that is kind of how Cook Sisters look. But yeah, we'll go ahead and move on to our coconut now, because that's looking pretty decent. Of course, you can play around with this. You can make this some sort of surrealist alien donut if you want. You can make everything blue. You can make it have like subsurface that's green. You can do whatever you want, right? You don't have to follow this tutorial perfectly. I'm just showing you what these settings do, how to do it. Do your own thing, right? It's the best way to learn. Just mess around with stuff. Okay, so we have our donut. Let's go ahead and reactivate our coconut. And let's make a shader for it and adjust how it looks. So currently, I'm not exactly happy with it. I'm going to close this Karma viewer and go back into the coconut generator, right? So we have this over here. We have these points being scattered. And over here, we end up with this coconut. These pieces are looking a bit too big for my liking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the density scale to 1000 so that there's more pieces of coconut. So we have something like that. Then I'm going to go over to the scale and I'm going to decrease its scale. Remember, middle mouse on a parameter name and slide it over. So we're going to reduce it until we're happy with the size of it. Maybe something like that. Okay, so let's take a look at that. And that's not looking too bad. The only thing is it's standing away from the surface. And that's because our noise value is just too great. So we can reduce this amplitude over here to something like 0.01 and reduce the element size to 0.025. Something like that. Okay, cool. So our coconut looks a little nicer, but wouldn't it be cool if it was less uniform? Let's do that. If we go in here, we can add an attribute noise before our scatter node. So let's go ahead and add an attribute noise. And right over here, we're going to create an attribute called density. So we're going to turn it to a float. I have a video on vectors and floats. I'm not going to go into it right now, but just know that if we want a single basic value for density, we're going to set it to float. Vectors for things like color and position, where there's more than one value that makes it up. So like in the case of color, it's red, green, and blue. So it's actually 3 values. In the case of position, it's X, Y, and Z. Again, 3 values. Those are vectors. We just want density, which is a single value. So we set it to float. We're going to call this density. And over here, we're going to go to our scatter node, and we're going to use this density attribute, right? We have this density attribute. Now, the actual scattering is based on this density. And we can actually visualize this density on our attribute noise node. If we go over here and click on it, that's actually our noise. If you don't quite understand the whole color system, it works from a scale of cold to warm. So blue is like cold, low values, and red is a warm, high value. So if we go ahead and just make some changes to this, you'll start to understand what I'm saying. Let's change our element size on our noise. So it's scaled down a bit. As you can see, that pattern is a bit smaller. And let's go ahead and use this enable remap ramp. What this allows is for us to define how much of either end of the noise we want. Do we want more high value noise or low value noise? So if we drag this over, you'll end up with more of these blue patches. And if we drag this over, we'll end up with more of those red and orange areas. And if we go back to our scatter node, you'll see that it tends to scatter where there's a higher density value. So red being a higher value. And so this color is just a visualizer, and we can switch off visualizers. You can go back over here and switch it off over here. Or down at the bottom over here, we can disable our visualizers in our viewport. Okay, so now that we have that, we have a different scattering for our coconut, and we can make changes to this. We can adjust the offset of our noise over here. So I'm going to go back to this, switch on our visualizer for it, and then just adjust the offset. Right, so as you adjust the offset, it changes the position of the noise, and as we go, we end up with a bit more of an interesting distribution of coconut. Cool. So there's some areas of higher concentration, and we can still mess around with that more if you want. Okay, cool. That looks pretty good. So let's go through our camera view. Let's go to our material network, and let's add another principled shader. This one will be for our coconut. So we can call this coconut. And over here, again, we won't be using point color. We'll set this to a nice sort of light off-white. And coconut's pretty rough, so we'll increase the roughness over there. And let's go ahead and use subsurface scattering again. So again, and we'll reduce this value super low, so like 0.05. And over here on our coconut generator, we can again go to the render tab, choose the material that we want, and choose coconut. Right, so now this donut over here has the material donut. This over here has the material coconut. And if we go ahead to our out level and again enter our Karma Viewport, let's take a look at what we have now. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. We'll go ahead and reduce the subsurface distance even lower. So barely anything at all. Maybe increase the size of our coconut. And these are all things that you want to play around with just until you're happy with what you have. So that's looking pretty cool, right? And if we want to change our position of our camera, we can do that too. So let's go ahead and close our Karma Viewport and switch on the lock for our camera so that our camera is locked to our view. And then just move around until we're happy with the new position of it. I think something like that might look cool. And what I'm going to do is also add a material for the floor. So principled shader, I'm going to call this one floor. I'm going to make it slightly reflective. So 0.3 might actually be nice. We'll give it a base color of maybe a nice light blue, something like that. And let's go ahead and instead of doing it the way that we did it for the others, let's just click and drag it over. You'll notice that the thing that we're dragging over becomes yellow. And if we let go and go to our floor, you'll notice that it's assigned it for us. Under the render tab, our material has been assigned to it. Okay, back up to our Karma Viewport. That looks pretty good. So it's quite an interesting look, I guess. It is a bit weird, obviously, because it's a squishy looking donut. But I mean, you can play around with these settings and end up with something that looks pretty cool. We can increase the roughness on our floor a little bit, maybe decrease the intensity of that one light. And just like that, you start to end up with something that's decently interesting, right? And this viewport render is fairly fast, so it's very easy to find a new position for where you want to render. So, okay, let's have some fun with this donut. Let's hide our coconut for a bit, go to our materials, go to the donut, and let's try something crazy. Let's go ahead and make our donut, let's go blue. Let's go blue with our donut, something like that. And let's make it more squishy looking. This will probably make it look like toothpaste. So we'll go 0.05 over there. And we'll give it a sort of greenish subsurf. And let's just remove that displacement. So remember your displacement noise over here, you can just disable it to make it super smooth and shiny. We'll go over here and we'll remove our coat so it no longer has a coat. And then decrease its actual roughness so that it's completely shiny. And as you can see, you end up with some really interesting, weird looking things, right? Like this is pretty cool, actually. I think this is cooler than a donut, whatever this might be. But as you can see, you can just play around with your settings and just come up with whatever you want. And when it comes to actually rendering this out, it's pretty straightforward. So just know that in Houdini, when we render, it's going to render images or image sequences. So if we go ahead and just go back to our viewport like this, we can render from here, from the Karma Viewport, or from our out level. So let's go to the out level. And if we click on render to disk, it'll begin rendering. So I'm going to click render to disk, and you won't see anything pop up. That's because Karma just renders in the background. So if you go over here to your scheduler, so under render, you have scheduler, you can see over here that we have a render that's busy going in the background. It's been going for 15 seconds. You can pause it or end it if you want. But we'll just let it come to completion. And then I'll show you where it gets saved. Okay, so once it's completed, it took 30 seconds, we can go ahead and find that render. So where is that render? Well, the render is placed at this location over here. And this might be something that looks really confusing to decipher, but I can break it down for you. So over here, $hip is where this actual file is saved. So is it saved in my documents? Is it saved in your desktop? Wherever it's saved, that's what $hip is. Look where this file is saved. Then it says, okay, create a folder. If you can't find a folder called render inside of this location, then just create it. But we're going to be placing all of our renders inside this folder called render with this following name. This name, it's a bit confusing, but basically it's just the name of the file, $hip name, so whatever you've named your file. And then this over here is the name of the node that it's rendering from, so Karma1. And this over here is the current frame number. And then .exr is the file type. So exr is the file type, that can be whatever, PNG, whatever. Generally, I would just change this last part. So it'll still save to wherever this file is saved in a folder called render, but then we can give it our own custom name. So alien donut dot, and it doesn't have to be exr, you can do PNG. And then if you render to disk, it'll do that whole thing for you. So if we go and find that folder, so I can go over here to my donut render file, right? This is where my donut render file has been saved. So this is that $hip that you see. So inside of $hip, create a file called render, and that's exactly what it did for me. It created a render file. And inside of there, you'll find your alien donut, right, rendered out. And it does come with a watermark. Remember, we're using the apprentice version of Houdini. It's the free version, so it's always going to render with that watermark. There's our gross looking alien donut, and you'll see that it's a bit noisy and stuff. If you want, you can just increase the quality of the render, right? So things like subsurface tend to be noisier, and you can just increase the quality. It'll take a bit longer to render, but you'll end up with a cleaner image. And so that's it, right? That's how you go from having just this file with a donut in it to setting up a camera, lights, adding materials, rendering in Karma. We did a lot in this part. And if you're confused by anything, don't stress too much, honestly. Like, we'll constantly be revisiting these concepts. We'll constantly be going between the object level and the out level, material networks. All of those things will constantly be jumping around until it really like solidifies in your mind. And then it will be super easy, right? These things just take a bit of practice. It's a bit of a different workflow, but honestly, it's quite a nice workflow. You have all of your objects over here. You have a place to create all of your materials. You assign your materials to your objects, and then you go ahead and you render them out in a separate place. Again, the way you want to think about Houdini is almost as like a house with different rooms in it. Each room has different functionality, right? You have a kitchen for cooking and you have a bedroom for sleeping. It's all still within the same environment. You're just going between them, right? To do whatever you need to do. That's kind of how Houdini works. So that's it for this part. I hope that wasn't too confusing. If you are interested, send me all of your random donut renders on our Instagram. That's at 9_between, and I'll take a look at them there. And yeah, thanks for watching. I hope to see you next time. Bye.